The judge issued a ruling against a black woman. Then it suddenly dawned on him that she'd actually drafted the legislation. When the gavel came down, it made a loud, sharp sound that bounced around the courtroom. "Ms. Caldwell, you will be penalized $125,000 immediately," Judge William Hawthorne stated, his tone showing no warmth whatsoever. A sense of unease permeated the courtroom, with a few people murmuring while others were clearly shocked. Even the city attorney, who'd been sitting there looking pleased with himself, seemed momentarily thrown off balance. However, Monica Caldwell remained unfazed. I remained seated, my hands resting politely on the table, my whole demeanor calm and steady. I didn't let any rage surface, if I even felt any. There wasn't a trace of any surprise on my face, either. The judge fixed his eyes on me, anticipating some sort of response. He got nothing. Instead, I leaned forward, slowly sipped from my water glass, and then put it back on the table without making a sound. After that, I straightened my glasses, took a look at the papers neatly organized in front of me, and finally looked directly at Hawthorne. "Your Honor," I said, my voice level, composed, and purposeful, "before I say anything about this decision, I'd like to ask for some clarification." Hawthorne leaned forward a bit, his lips curling with a touch of annoyance. "Clarification, yes." I interlaced my fingers, slightly inclining my head. "Am I correct in hearing you declare that a person in this courtroom doesn't deserve a fair trial?" No response. Someone in the back muttered a hushed, "Damn." Hawthorne's nostrils widened, but he quickly regained his composure. "I'm asserting that the law is straightforward, Ms. Caldwell." That's something, I thought, because I was involved in creating that law. Now the entire room became completely still. The person taking notes for the court paused, her fingers poised above the keyboard. The officer, who had been standing with arms crossed, suddenly seemed more attentive. Even those watching, made up of lawyers, assistants, and general observers, leaned forward in their chairs. Hawthorne's expression darkened. I rearranged the papers in front of me, though I didn't actually need them. I'd spent years developing rules, improving legislation, and perfecting legal language to guarantee justice in local government. And now I was sitting before a judge who thought he could twist the very laws that I'd helped put into place. "I must have heard you wrong," I continued, my voice conveying a sense of composed authority. "Are you suggesting that I'm breaking a law that I helped write?" Hawthorne's grip on the bench tightened. "Your contribution to the process of making laws is unimportant to this court." "That's very interesting," I responded calmly, "because it should be really important in deciding if this fine is actually valid." Another wave of hushed talking moved through the room. I saw the judge take a sharp breath, moving around in his seat. He told me he wouldn't permit any dramatic displays in the courtroom. He wanted to hear my legal reasoning, and that was all. Happily, I slowly and respectfully nodded. I reached for the first paper on my desk and held it up for everyone to see. This was the complete text of Municipal Code 23A, the law that the judge had just quoted as the cause for my penalty. "I know you think the law is straightforward," I pointed out, "but if it were that obvious, we wouldn't be facing this case now." The man's jaw tightened. "The law has been approved in this courtroom before, I knew." But then I added with a little smile, not in its present version, though. "You see, the words of 23A had been updated 2 years ago, following an examination that decided particular pieces of the law were unconstitutional." Now his expression went cold. I proceeded, flipping through the papers in my hands. Before, the law gave local officials a lot of freedom in giving out fines without set proof requirements. I explained that the ruling was a direct violation of due process in Caldwell v. City of Atlanta. I paused to let it all sink in. "That was a case I handled myself," I added. "The appellate court's verdict was very clear. Administrative fines given under this law had to follow strict evidence guidelines." I gave the words time to resonate in the room. The other man's silence told me plenty. The city attorney made a sound in his throat, visibly ill at ease. I heard the city attorney start to speak. "Your Honor, if I may." I pivoted towards him before he finished. I had to ask, "Mr. Baines, are you representing the city in this matter?" He paused, hesitant. I saw her motion towards her documents, and I wondered, could you clarify why the city is utilizing an old version of this particular law, even though my case established a legal precedent? The man shuffled through his own papers, almost as if he was desperately searching for a solution. I turned my attention back to the judge and thought, Am I supposed to believe the city's legal representatives are actually oblivious to the fact that this law has been updated? Hawthorne started tapping his fingers on his bench. That's enough. You're close to being in contempt, Miss Caldwell, he warned me. I breathed out gently. Contempt of what, Your Honor? Understanding the law. The room's whispers became even more noticeable. Hawthorne's expression had shifted into one of absolute rage. But this was a judge accustomed to demanding respect through intimidation and power. He certainly wasn't going to yield. He stiffly announced, "You're free to file an appeal. However, my decision remains in effect." I slightly angled my head, trying to read his unspoken intentions. He was providing himself with an escape, a way to retreat without fully admitting he was wrong. But I wasn't here for compromises. I slightly leaned forward, making eye contact with him. Your Honor, if this judgment remains, it sets a precedent where municipal fines can be given based on outdated laws, lacking any supporting evidence, and also without the defendant receiving a fair opportunity to be heard. I allowed the meaning of my words to sink in and then continued. That is far more than an abuse of power. It's judicial misconduct. The courtroom exploded with noise. People gasped and whispered, and the attorneys exchanged bewildered looks. For just a fraction of a second, the court reporter even stopped typing. Hawthorne's face grew grim. I held his gaze. I just trapped him, and he understood that. If he stubbornly stuck to his position, he'd risk this ruling being thrown out on appeal, something embarrassing for a judge of his standing. On the other hand, if he retracted his statement, he'd be conceding he'd jumped the gun. No one spoke for a long moment. It seemed like everyone in the room held their breath, anticipating what he would do. Then Hawthorne slowly let out a sigh. "The court will take a break," he announced, his words sharp and brief. He hammered his gavel down. 15 minutes. He got up, turned around, and vanished into his chambers. I watched him go, understanding perfectly what had just occurred. The judge didn't want to rule against me. However, he also wasn't prepared to rule in my favor. This indicated that when he returned, he wouldn't be on his own, and that's when the real struggle would start. The door to the judge's chambers slammed shut behind Hawthorne, leaving a heavy silence hanging in the courtroom. The spectators, who were previously a noisy collection of whispers and quick glances, were now filled with a tense, contained energy. They had all just seen something shocking, something risky. I remained seated, and no one could decipher my expression. I knew precisely what was going on behind that closed door. Hawthorne wasn't just pausing to collect himself. He was calling for assistance. Baines, the city attorney, fidgeted nervously in his chair. His gaze flicked back and forth from Monica to the empty judge's seat, as if considering whether to speak up or just act like he didn't notice. I allowed him to feel awkward. Instead, I reached for my pen and with careful intention wrote something on my notepad. I wasn't taking notes. I was prolonging the silence, letting the impact of my last statement sink into the atmosphere of the courtroom. I had accused a current judge of wrongdoing in his own courtroom, with a room full of legal professionals watching. He couldn't just brush that aside. 15 minutes went by, then 20. The pressure in the room grew heavier with each passing second. Finally, the door opened again, but Hawthorne wasn't by himself. A second judge walked in with him. Judge Richard Calloway, who was senior, held a higher rank, was highly regarded, and, as I immediately recognized, was deliberately selected. I had encountered men like Calloway before. He was the sort of judge they brought in when the system needed to protect itself, when an institution felt threatened and required someone to extinguish a problem without it appearing to be a cover-up. Calloway sat down next to Hawthorne, his presence a wordless announcement. This had moved beyond a simple hearing. It had become a struggle for dominance. I straightened my robe, then I coughed a bit. "Ms. Caldwell, before we start, Judge Calloway is going to be watching this hearing." I watched as a slow smile stretched across Monica's face. An observer, Calloway clasped his hands together and his voice was calm. "Because of how serious the accusations are that you've brought forward, I thought it was best to keep this hearing honest." Honest? That's rich. I sat back in my chair, savoring the moment. "And did you come to this decision all by yourself, Your Honor? Or did Judge Hawthorne ask you to be here?" Calloway didn't react, but the delay was long enough for me to know what he was thinking. I gave the moment space before I spoke again. "I don't care if there's another person listening, Judge Calloway, but if this is about fairness, then I hope it applies to everyone, even the judge." A new wave of whispers spread through the courtroom. Calloway kept smiling, but it was a little strained this time. Let's not make this a show, Ms. Caldwell. You've brought up problems with how Municipal Code 23A is being followed. Let's concentrate on that. Ah, there it was, the attempt to corner me. I nodded. Of course, and since we're talking about the rules, let's begin with the fundamental need for evidence. I found myself looking at Hawthorne again. The decision made by the court mentioned a breach of Rule 23A, but there's been nothing shown to back it up. Hawthorne stood up a bit straighter. The city's official in charge of enforcing the rules gave out a citation based on what they saw firsthand. What they saw firsthand, Monica repeated. I paused on those words, letting them hang there, and then I cocked my head. That's curious, because public records show that this particular officer has written more than 70 tickets just in the past 12 months, and a lot of them were thrown out because there wasn't any actual proof. Hawthorne's hands moved slightly. I shifted a little. Let's get him in here, don't you think? There was some shuffling around in the back of the room. Brian Calloway, the official in charge of enforcement, who I realized with only a bit of surprise was a cousin of Judge Calloway, came forward. He was a big man in his 50s, wearing a uniform that was perfectly ironed, and his face looked like he was certain his word would be enough. He sat down in the witness chair, fiddling with the microphone. I didn't waste any time. Officer Calloway, did you write the ticket in this case? Yes, ma'am, he responded in a self-assured way. And what proof did you have to support the alleged violation? He blinked. My professional judgment. I gave a little smile, but there wasn't any friendliness in it. Did you take any pictures? No. Did you measure anything? No. I didn't get any witness statements, that's correct. Did I write anything down about it? He paused for a second. I did complete the citation report. Monica's grin grew broader. Okay, just to be clear, the reason for this fine is your personal judgment without any proof whatsoever. The whispers in the courtroom became more pronounced. Calloway moved in his seat. I don't hand out fines without reason. I'm certain you don't, Monica replied calmly, but let's discuss legal principles. According to Caldwell versus the City of Atlanta, she let the name linger for a moment. The appeals court declared that any administrative fine given without supporting evidence is immediately dismissed. Judge Calloway's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what she was getting at. Monica continued, Your Honor, what I perceive here is an officer who didn't record any infraction, a judge who imposed a fine based solely on spoken words, and a legal standard that clearly says this kind of decision is illegal. She slowly glanced at both judges and asked, Should I elaborate? Hawthorne's hands tightened into fists on the bench. Calloway gave no indication of his feelings, but she could see him thinking. The courtroom's tension was palpable. Monica allowed the quiet to build, then addressed the city attorney. Mr. Baines, are you ready to present an opposing argument, or should we just disregard this penalty? Baines opened his mouth and then quickly closed it. He appeared to seek guidance from Hawthorne, but the judge remained fixated, his expression unyielding. Finally, Calloway broke the silence. The court will be adjourned once more, he declared. There was a brief silence, then the gavel came down. I leaned back as the judges departed once more. I understood precisely what was unfolding. They were out of options. The entire process was falling apart right there for everyone to witness. And when they returned, there wouldn't be enough adhesive to keep it together. I didn't bother standing when the judges left the courtroom. I didn't move in my seat, didn't fiddle with my paperwork, and didn't even look at the buzzing group of lawyers, assistants, and onlookers, all completely absorbed in the events. I remained still composed because I understood something the judges didn't want to acknowledge. They were defeated. The realization was sinking in now, weighing down their carefully crafted control, threatening to crumble the very basis they had spent so long trying to bolster. Calloway had been brought in as a tool to regain order, but I had foreseen this. I'd known the second Hawthorne asked for a break. And I was prepared. Now they were desperately searching for a means to manipulate the law to their advantage without exposing themselves. But there was no graceful escape from this. From the instant Calloway assumed his position, the instant he got involved in this whole thing, he transformed a straightforward judgment into a test of wills. And Monica Caldwell never backed down in a power play. The door to the judge's private area opened again, and a strange quiet fell over the room. You could practically feel the strain. It was like a tight wire stretched across the courtroom, ready to break. Hawthorne was the first to return, moving in a rigid way, very composed, the outward show of being a judge carefully back in place. Calloway came in right after, but something about his face had changed. The easygoing self-assurance that he had displayed when he walked in earlier was gone, replaced by something more considered, as if he was rethinking things. They had figured out what they were going to do. Monica allowed them to settle in, letting the quiet sink in. Then I spoke. "Your honors, I hope that break was beneficial." Hawthorne fidgeted with his fingers. Calloway gave no response whatsoever. I smiled. "May we continue?" Calloway was the one to speak. "We've gone over your arguments, Ms. Caldwell, and although we understand your issues, we don't believe there's enough reason to throw out this fine." A wave of shock seemed to pass through everyone present. Even the city attorney seemed taken aback for a second, like he thought Calloway would completely reverse the decision, not dig in further. I exhaled slowly. "I understand. What specifically about my objections didn't hold up?" Calloway clasped his hands together. "Although there are established rules about how evidence is handled, this court has the power to make its own decisions when it comes to local ordinances." I realized the strategy. Hawthorne was handing the reins to Calloway, moving the discussion from legal principles to the court's freedom to decide. It was a deliberate maneuver, a way to support their conclusion without breaking the rules. It felt like a last resort. I slowly nodded, then looked toward the people watching, letting my eyes go over all the lawyers there. Discretion. I said the word carefully, letting it hang in the air. That's an intriguing concept because, correct me if I'm wrong, Your Honor, but shouldn't discretion be used within the rules, not in defiance of them? Calloway's face tensed up just a little. I kept speaking in a way that seemed casual. "But what I perceive is an attempt to disregard legal precedent by picking and choosing when to apply discretion. Maybe I'm wrong, but I thought courts were there to enforce the law, not to change it every time a new case comes up." The whispers in the room grew louder. Calloway took a slow breath. "Ms. Caldwell, I have to ask you to be careful about making accusations about this court's honesty." "Oh, I'm not implying anything about the court's ethics," I said easily. "I find myself doubting the fairness of this decision." Hawthorne gripped his gavel even tighter, clearly losing his composure. Monica was now focused entirely on Calloway. "Perhaps we should discuss judicial leeway, don't you think? Because if this judgment is upheld, it creates a scenario where a judge can levy a penalty solely based on their position, without any evidence, without following proper procedure, and with no legal basis." Her tone became noticeably sharper. "That isn't discretion, Your Honor. That's blatant power." The room fell completely silent. Calloway maintained a calm demeanor, but I noticed how his fingers subtly tightened on the bench. He wasn't accustomed to being questioned in this way. Hawthorne spoke at last, his voice curt. "Ms. Caldwell, I strongly advise you to be cautious." I tilted my head slightly. "Or what? You'll find me in contempt for citing legal precedents, for highlighting the glaring problems with this decision." I leaned forward ever so slightly. "Or is it because you dislike the fact that I refuse to back down?" Hawthorne's mouth formed a thin, tight line. I settled back, projecting an aura of collected confidence. "You see, Your Honor, my problem isn't a lack of respect for this court's authority. It's that I have greater respect for the law itself." The whispers intensified, creating a palpable tension in the room. Calloway looked toward Hawthorne, and in that brief instant, I saw it, the uncertainty, the skepticism. They were aware that they were in a precarious position. I thought I'd push it just a bit more. "This is what's going to unfold. The fine will either be thrown out, or I'll immediately submit an appeal. If the appeal makes it to the appellate court, they'll scrutinize not only this particular decision, but also every decision made in similar situations. If they discover a pattern of overstepping by the court, well," she let the unspoken possibility linger. Calloway's jaw tightened. He absolutely understood what she meant. Hawthorne finally looked at him, his face blank. And then, for the first time, Calloway looked unsure. I leaned back, anticipating. I waited for the legal system to determine what held more importance, safeguarding itself or preserving the appearance of fairness. Then Calloway let out a breath. "This court will resume in 2 days," he stated, his voice steady, though not completely composed. In those 48 hours, they'd assess the issues that were brought up and think about making any needed adjustments to the judgment. It wasn't a win, not yet, but it was a breakthrough. Monica Caldwell had just made the court rethink its own power. That was the start of something significantly larger. I walked out of the courthouse into the fatting sunlight, the air heavy with the day's humidity. I could feel the intensity of the last few hours weighing me down, but I didn't let it show. Not at the moment. As I descended the courthouse stairs, a few reporters, positioned nearby, took photos, and their whispers trailed after me like a quiet buzz. They didn't have the complete picture yet, but they sensed something significant was about to happen. I maintained my pace, kept my chin up, and regulated my breathing. I was succeeding. However, I wasn't foolish enough to believe this was finished. I could tell by Calloway's expression just before they recessed. His controlled composure had shifted into something different, something that seemed planned. They weren't surrendering. They were strategizing, and that meant I had to be prepared. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I took it out and noticed a text from David Tran, one of the most insightful investigative journalists I knew. "David, I heard you stirred up some trouble today. Are you available to chat?" I gave a slight smile. David didn't bother with unnecessary niceties. "Monica, not yet, but keep a close eye on this case. There's more to it than meets the eye." I put the phone back and continued walking. I needed to get ready. I had to determine what their next move would be. Since they were intelligent, and I knew they wouldn't challenge me on the established legal principles. That was already a lost cause. No, they'd attack me personally. I just had to be ready. The following day, I was in my office going over case files when my assistant, Reggie Wallace, entered. His face was creased with a frown, which was unusual for him. "You've got to look at this," he said, putting his tablet on my desk. I took a quick look at the screen. I immediately saw the headline, "Attorney Monica Caldwell under scrutiny for conflict of interest in court case." Taking a slow, deep breath, I tried to stay collected. Reggie began scrolling. The article claimed that because I had helped create 23A, I shouldn't be allowed to go against it in court. I settled back in my chair, studying the words on the screen. This wasn't just an accusation. It was a calculated plan. Hawthorne and Calloway must have leaked this to the press during the night, turning it into a story that put me under pressure. It was a well-worn tactic. When you can't win against someone in court, you try them in the court of public opinion instead. Reggie folded his arms. "How do you want to address this?" I let out a sharp breath. "We fight back." Reggie's lips curved into a slight smile. "Good, because I've already scheduled an interview with the Atlanta Ledger for this afternoon." I looked up at him. "You don't waste any time. I work for you." "That means I can't afford to waste time." I smiled, the tightness in my chest beginning to relax just a bit. "Let's get to it." When she reached the studio for the interview, the story had already gone viral. The live segment was being broadcast throughout Georgia, and I understood that the situation was critical. The host, Lindsay Parks, had a reputation for being blunt and direct. I knew she wasn't easily influenced, so I had to be absolutely perfect in what I said. As soon as the cameras started rolling, Lindsay immediately launched into the questions. "Ms. Caldwell, you're being criticized because of what some people see as a conflict of interest. You helped craft the very law that you're now disputing in court. How do you answer that?" I clasped my hands in my lap, striving to appear composed. "That's a reasonable question, Lindsay. But let's really analyze this. The notion that I shouldn't be able to challenge this fine simply because I helped create the law is absurd. People question and interpret laws all the time, and the individuals who draft them don't lose their right to legal action." Lindsay acknowledged my words, but continued her line of questioning. "But your adversaries claim you're using your position to undermine the authority of the court system." My smile didn't change. "And that's the real issue, isn't it? Because this isn't really about the fine. It's all about control. It's about whether judges like Hawthorne can have the absolute right to apply monetary penalties without adhering to the law. And let's be completely transparent. This isn't solely my battle. If they're capable of doing this to me, consider what they're probably doing to the people who don't have the ability to fight back." I leaned back a little, carefully weighing my words. "So you're implying this situation extends beyond just me?" Monica agreed with a nod. That was always the reality. When the interview concluded, Monica's account spread quickly across the internet within an hour. The story had been completely transformed by her account. Still, I knew this wouldn't be sufficient. Because Hawthorne and Calloway wouldn't halt their efforts at this point. They still planned another maneuver, and it would be a malicious one. That evening, as I sat in my office, studying some of my notes, Reggie burst in, visibly enraged. "You won't believe what I've found." I raised an eyebrow, inviting him to continue. "Tell me." Reggie threw a folder onto my desk with a loud thud. "They're researching your history, particularly your volunteer work." I knit my brow and opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of old case files. The cases I had undertaken, representing underprivileged groups. The cases where I had struggled to combat unfair evictions, erroneous arrests, and corporate wrongdoing. "This is all available to the public," I stated, as I thumbed through the documents. Reggie confirmed that they were, but they're distorting the information. They're suggesting that you've been singling out businesses for your own benefit. They want to portray you as someone pushing a specific agenda. I sighed and closed the folder. They were starting to get desperate. And desperate individuals act without thinking. I looked at Reggie directly. "Then we allow them to reveal too much of their plan." Reggie looked puzzled. "How?" I smiled slowly and with a sharp edge. "We make them intensify their efforts. I allowed them to propagate this idea that I was too volatile, too much of a troublemaker. Once they went that far, they'd reveal who they truly were." Reggie's eyes held a knowing glint. "You're laying a snare," Monica agreed, her head bobbing slightly. "And when they stumble into it, they won't see what's coming. Because this wasn't about that measly fine anymore. It was about breaking down the structure that let guys like Hawthorne and Calloway prosper. The next time the hearing took place, she was going to level everything. The atmosphere in the courthouse felt different this time." Monica sensed it the moment she walked in. It wasn't just the usual stress of a courtroom conflict. It was deeper, buzzing, like the very building was preparing for something big. The crowd was bigger. Journalists were crammed everywhere, their cameras flashing, whispering about all the uncertainty. Lawyers, clerks, and law students were crammed in the viewing area, drawn to the intensity of what was happening. Monica walked past them, her heels clicking on the stone floor, expression composed. I didn't hurry, didn't let them see any sign of doubt. I knew specifically why they were there. They had all seen the character assassination happen. They had watched as her unpaid work was warped into a tool used against her. The city attorney's office had leaked certain documents, presenting a narrative that painted me as a political player, not a lawyer fighting for what was right. They believed they had effectively trapped her. They believed they had successfully painted her as the bad guy. Yet, what they'd truly accomplished, what they'd failed to understand, was that they had given her the ideal opening. This wasn't just about the official charges anymore. Now, it was about revealing the truth. I walked through the heavy courtroom entrance and took my spot at the defense table. Facing me, the city attorney, Baines, sat rigidly, his typical cocky self-assurance swapped with something more controlled. He knew he had instructions, knew he was expected to push her, trying to make this a personal attack. He also knew, deep down, that their plan wouldn't succeed. Up front, Hawthorne and Calloway sat at the judge's bench. They both seemed collected, but I saw past their facade. I noticed the tension in Hawthorne's jaw, the way his fingers tapped twice on the wood before he stopped himself. He was expecting me to show some emotion. I didn't give him the satisfaction. The bailiff declared the courtroom in session, and Calloway jumped right in. "Ms. Caldwell, before we discuss the legal issues you raised earlier, this court needs to figure out if you're even able to contest this decision." I sighed quietly, already aware of their strategy. Calloway clasped his hands together. "Considering your involvement in creating Municipal Code 23A, it must be determined whether you have a conflict of interest in these matters." Some whispers spread through the room. There it was. They weren't debating the truth of the matter. Their aim was to have her removed. I leaned back, slightly cocking my head to one side. "Your Honor, I understand this line of reasoning is founded on the idea that, because I helped write the laws, I can't dispute how they're used." Calloway moved his head slowly, as if in agreement. That's a pretty big problem, I thought. I shifted my gaze to those watching, my voice taking on an edge. "So I'm guessing you intend to apply this principle universally. Is every attorney who ever had a hand in crafting legislation now forbidden from taking cases related to it?" The room went silent. I let my eyes wander over the courtroom. "Because if that's the precedent we establish today, then we'll have to start disqualifying entire firms of lawyers who help write rules, and then use those same rules to defend their clients. We'd have to prevent state prosecutors who worked on criminal justice changes from trying cases that involve new sentencing rules. I looked back at Calloway. Yet we both understand that's not the issue at play, don't we? Calloway's mouth became a straight line. I moved my body forward slightly. What's going on here is a desperate attempt to deny me my right to a fair trial simply because this court doesn't want to deal with what's truly in front of us. A wave of whispers spread through the room. Hawthorne made a sound, clearing his throat. He seemed annoyed. "Ms. Caldwell, the matter is that your influence—" "My influence," I said smoothly, interrupting him. "Or my understanding." I could sense the tension mounting. Calloway let out a sigh. "Your participation makes everything less unbiased." Monica raised an eyebrow. Unbiased. She let the word linger in the air before turning back toward the city attorney. "Mr. Baines, maybe you can clear something up for me." Baines stiffened. "Go ahead." Monica tapped a document on the table. "This is a list of all the cases Judge Hawthorne has handled concerning Municipal Code 23A over the past 3 years. Tell me, in how many of those cases did the ruling provide financial advantages to organizations with connections to the city's development board?" Baines swallowed hard. Monica faced Calloway again. "If we're discussing conflicts of interest, perhaps we should start there." The courtroom filled with soft chatter. Hawthorne's hand tightened on his gavel. "Ms. Caldwell, this isn't a political argument." "No, Your Honor," Monica said, remaining composed. "It's a legal one. Therefore, we stick to the law, not what's easy." I could perceive Calloway reconsidering, rethinking. He understood they had gone too far. Hawthorne realized this as well, though he was too invested now. I leaned back, keeping my face steady. "Now, if this court is done trying to undermine me, I'd like to get back to the core issues of this case." Calloway's jaw clenched. Then, at last, he released a breath. "Please continue." Monica smiled a little, because now it was time to take them apart one step at a time. A change permeated the courtroom's atmosphere. I sensed it, similar to the feeling before a major weather event. The efforts to damage my reputation hadn't succeeded. Calloway was compelled to let me continue. However, that didn't mean they'd stopped trying to undermine me. They were adopting a defensive strategy now. That meant it was time to deliver the final blow. I stood there, straightening my blazer and turned toward the judge's bench, my voice composed, yet conveying authority. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Officer Calloway back to the witness stand." Hawthorne's jaw clenched, but he couldn't refuse the request without revealing his own prejudice. He gave a curt nod. "Proceed." A quiet rustle swept through the courtroom as Brian Calloway, the municipal enforcement officer, returned to the witness stand. His uniform remained impeccable, his bearing rigid. Yet there was something different in his gaze now, a hint of uncertainty. I had already proved that he had given the citation without any real proof. Now I was planning to crush the case altogether. I walked toward the stand, my face impassive. "Officer Calloway, you previously stated that the ticket you gave me was based on your own observation." He affirmed with a nod. "That's right." I held up a document. "And this is the official violation report you presented?" "Yes." I looked down at the paper, slowly turning the pages. "I found that fascinating," she said in a casual tone. "I realized something important while reading this report." She flipped to the next page, then another. A moment of quiet passed. Hawthorne changed his position. "Ms. Caldwell, if there's something you want to say, just say it." "Yes, I do," Monica replied without a hint of stress. She glanced back at Calloway. "Officer, can you tell me what time you wrote this ticket?" He looked a little confused. "Around 3:30 in the afternoon," he said. Monica agreed with a nod. "And where exactly did you make this evaluation?" Calloway seemed to pause. "At the specific location." Monica raised an eyebrow. "You're certain about that?" "Yes." She let out a sigh, like she really didn't want to do what was coming. Then she held up a different piece of paper. "Based on the city's GPS records for all of the city's vehicles, your patrol car was not even close to the property at 3:30. The room went completely silent. Calloway seemed shocked. "What?" Monica moved closer, showing the page so everyone in the courtroom could see the GPS data. "These official records, city records I might add, prove that at the precise time you claim to have personally assessed my property, you were actually on the other side of town." She tilted her head. "So I'm just curious, officer, how did you figure out there was a violation from 10 miles away?" Calloway's mouth went open, and then shut. The whispering in the courtroom began again, this time a bit more frantic. Monica turned to the judges. "Your Honor, I argue that this ticket was never correctly issued." The lack of any proof wasn't the only issue. The officer who had supposedly reviewed the infraction wasn't even there when the ticket was issued. My knuckles tightened on the wooden bench. Calloway, on the other hand, became absolutely still. I saw it in his eyes when it hit him that he'd been framed. He was the patsy, the easily sacrificed piece in a bigger plot. They thought his story would hold up, but they never thought I'd investigate so thoroughly. I turned back to him. "Officer, do you know the consequences of filing a false report under city rules?" Calloway nervously gulped. Hawthorne brought down his gavel with a loud bang. "That's enough," I didn't even blink. My gaze stayed on Calloway, letting him fully absorb the enormity of the situation. Then I took a step back. I had no more questions. Calloway's hands gripped the railing before he eventually stood, refusing to meet anyone's eyes as he walked off the stand. I addressed the judges again. "Your Honor, considering this proof, I request that this fine be immediately dropped due to fraud and procedural irregularities." Calloway leaned slightly forward, choosing each word with care. "The evidence presented does bring up some questions." Hawthorne's jaw tightened. He was cornered and he knew it. But I wasn't finished. I let there be a short pause, letting them think they might be regaining control. Then I prepared for the last move. As I was examining Officer Calloway's history, I noticed something else. Calloway's head snapped up quickly. I turned my attention back to the courtroom, my voice composed. "Over the last 2 years, Officer Calloway has written more than 200 tickets using Municipal Code 23. Almost all those citations were given to businesses and property owners who had voiced objections to city-sponsored development plans." The room went quiet. Complete silence descended. Calloway appeared frightened now, his complexion turning pale. "That's not—" I raised another piece of paper. "I have found copies of internal emails from the city attorney's office talking about how they would enforce things in a targeted way. Specific properties were highlighted for infractions, not because of any real investigation, but based on who owned them and their financial standing." Suddenly, the courtroom erupted. Press members immediately grabbed their phones. Lawyers quickly whispered to each other. Even a few of the court staff looked completely shocked. Calloway glanced over at Baines, the city attorney, who suddenly looked like he wanted to disappear. I turned back to Calloway. "Officer, were you instructed to ticket certain properties?" He paused. That moment of doubt spoke volumes. The courtroom had changed. The judges no longer controlled the story, and now it was going off the rails. Hawthorne banged his gavel hard, his face red. "That is sufficient." I looked at him, remaining composed and resolute. "No, Your Honor, it's not." Calloway quickly stood up, his voice full of panic. "I was simply doing what I was told." And there it was, the last fracture in everything. Calloway had just completely thrown the city attorney's office under the bus. Turning back to Hawthorne, Monica spoke, her tone even but sharp. "Your Honor, it's not just about a monetary penalty anymore. This is about a deep pattern of power abuse. This court now needs to decide what it will do." Hawthorne breathed out a sharp, quick breath, his shoulders tense. Monica cocked her head slightly. "Will you safeguard this corruption, or will you act ethically?" Everyone in the courtroom was waiting with bated breath. The media was watching as well. Hawthorne knew he didn't have any more plays to make. He was already defeated. The only thing that mattered was how far he was willing to go before he'd acknowledge it. The courtroom had become a battleground. Monica was in the thick of it, her bearing unwavering even as everything around her seemed to be unraveling. The impact of Calloway's display still hung in the atmosphere, echoing through everyone, including the press and the very basis of the whole situation. Hawthorne had relinquished control. Calloway was desperately trying to minimize the damage. And Monica, she was prepared to finish this. The judge's stand was quiet. Hawthorne had kept quiet since Calloway's frantic confession. Calloway appeared calm, but I could see it, the slight tightness in his shoulders, the hint of strategic planning in his eyes. He was deciding what to do next, thinking about whether to salvage something or let everything fall apart completely. I watched Baines, the city attorney, and noticed how stiff he was, his jaw locked so tight that I worried he might actually shatter a tooth. I allowed the quiet to linger, letting the full impact of the recent events sink into the atmosphere of the room. Finally, I began to speak. "Your Honor, I stated, my tone steady and controlled. This case has gone beyond a simple fine. It is about the inherent corruption within the system. It's about power being used in a reckless manner, with no checks and balances, and without any form of responsibility. I shifted a bit, directing my words not just at the judge, but to everyone gathered in the courtroom. We now possess proof that the Municipal Code 23A has been consistently and wrongfully used to single out people and companies for political and financial reasons. This isn't fair legal procedure. This doesn't align with the law. This is an act of misuse. Calloway let out a sigh through his nose. Miss Caldwell, let's avoid turning this into a show. I raised an eyebrow. This stopped being a straightforward hearing from the moment your fellow officer attempted to charge me based on a made-up offense. That point was when Officer Calloway confessed he was just following instructions. It was also when I shared the emails displaying a clear pattern of corruption. Turning to Hawthorne, I continued, Your Honor, I request the immediate dropping of this fine based on fraud and violation of due process. Hawthorne remained silent. His silence was incredibly telling. Calloway made a sound as if he was trying to clear his throat. The court will need time to... I cut him off gently. I've had a chance to think things over. Honestly, this whole situation should have been resolved much sooner. It feels like we're in this predicament simply because those in authority thought they could get away with anything. She moved closer and her voice became more intense. So I have to ask once more, are you going to do what's right? You could feel the tension in the room. Hawthorne's hand tightened on his gavel. Even though his expression was blank, I could see the internal conflict in his eyes. He realized he was trapped. He knew the media, the lawyers, and everyone else in the gallery were fixed on him, waiting for his decision. If he dug in his heels, if he refused to overturn the fine, he could face serious scrutiny, real trouble. It wouldn't just be rumors of bad behavior. It would mean full-blown inquiries. Finally, his mouth opened. The court declares that the penalty against Ms. Caldwell doesn't have enough evidence to be upheld. His words were slow, like he was being forced to say them. I could sense the resentment in his voice. Hawthorne continued, stating that the fine is dismissed. The courtroom went wild. Journalists immediately grabbed their phones. Attorneys spoke to each other in hushed tones. The court staff shared amazed looks. I just stood there. I wasn't shocked. They really had no other option, but my work wasn't done. Your Honor, I said, trying to sound composed. This case might be over, but the larger consequences are still there. There are other people who were fined under similar conditions. Would the court be looking at those cases too? Calloway drew a sharp breath. I understood exactly what she was angling at. This court, Hawthorne stated, his jaw clenched, would do whatever was needed to guarantee justice. It was a brush-off, a deliberately evasive maneuver. Yet it was also a weakness beginning to appear, and Monica's plan was to dismantle it completely. She locked eyes with Hawthorne. I'll be keeping you to your word. Then she turned around, gathered her belongings, and left the courtroom. Behind her, the system was starting to fall apart, and she just made sure things would never be the same. Monica exited the courthouse and found herself facing a throng of flashing cameras and insistent voices. Ms. Caldwell, do you have anything to say? Is this the conclusion of the case, or is it just the start? What about Judge Hawthorne? Will he be held accountable? I raised my hand, quieting the commotion. The group of reporters leaned in, waiting expectantly, their pens ready, their cameras running. I took a breath, sensing the burden of the last few days sink into me. I had prevailed. But the triumph felt empty because I knew the battle was far from over. So I spoke, not just to them, but to everyone observing. This isn't about me, I declared, my voice steady. I'm focusing on a system designed to hurt the vulnerable while shielding those in positions of power. The court threw my case out today. But what about all the people who couldn't afford to challenge it? The ones who just paid the penalty because they felt they had no other option. The people watching started to move around, some signaling their understanding, others quietly talking to each other. This isn't just a one-off situation, she explained. It's a sign of a much deeper problem. If we don't address it, it'll just keep happening. Over and over, she looked straight into the cameras. Therefore, no, this isn't finished. Not until every single person who's been victimized by this corruption gets the justice they're owed. Not until those who misuse their authority are forced to answer for their actions. A wave of assent seemed to wash over the people present. Things were definitely changing. This had grown into something far larger than just my own situation. I started to walk away, but then I heard someone calling out from the back of the crowd. "Miss Caldwell." I turned around. It was a woman, probably in her 50s, dressed simply in a blue dress, and her eyes held a mixture of relief and desperation. "You don't know me," the woman stated as she walked forward. However, I was also penalized under that same law. I had to close my store because of it. Her voice shook a little, but she stood firm. I didn't fight back because I felt like I didn't stand a chance. I started walking towards her, ignoring the sound of the press. "My name is Angela Carter," she told me. I reached into my purse, took out a card, and gave it to Angela. "It's yours now." As Angela's fingers closed around the card, I could feel it, for the first time since we started this struggle. It wasn't just a win, it was a change in the dynamic. This is where things actually begin, I thought. Not in a single courtroom or in a single trial, but with the individuals who resolved to speak up. I glanced back at the cameras one final time. If your experiences are similar to Angela's, if you've been unfairly targeted, if you've been made to keep quiet, step forward. This battle isn't done, and we're only beginning to find our footing. After that, without saying anything else, I walked away. I understood then that the system would be permanently altered. The struggle for fairness depends on everyone's determination to make their voice heard.